Okay, because most of the Hebrew Bible is narrative, or a large portion of it, more than 50% really, it's important to understand what we call the narratological approach, the approach that we use to analyze a narrative. This is information that really comes from studies of literature. It's not only used in the Bible, it's used by people who study literature in outside of the Bible, just any literature. But to have an understanding of these things, it's important when we're analysing a narrative in the scripture to see that the Bible, although it's a sacred book and it's a book that we believe is inspired by God, that also is a human book, that it's actually literature. And so in our exegesis of narrative passages, we need to be aware of these things that help in understanding a narrative. The first thing that we want to look at in a narrative is the order of the story elements, the order in which the events are told in the story. Normally we expect a story to be told in some kind of chronological order, but sometimes information is withheld and it's not told to us till later. We have a classic example of this in 1 Samuel. In chapter 16 in 1 Samuel, David has been anointed, and it says in verse 14, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendants said to him, 'See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for somebody who can play the harp. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes upon you, and you will feel better.' So Saul said to his attendants, 'Find someone who plays well and bring him to me.' One of the servants answered, 'I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the harp. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him.' Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, 'Send me your son David, who is with the sheep.' So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor-bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, 'Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him.' Whenever the Spirit from God came upon Saul, David would take his harp and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him." Okay, so here we have David has come into Saul's service. David plays the harp for Saul. David has become Saul's armor bearer. That's a very close relationship that he has with him, and it seems as though Saul knows David very well. He certainly knows who David's father is, because he sent word to David's father. But in chapter 17, which is where we see David fighting Goliath, after David has fought Goliath, in verse 55, chapter 17, verse 55, "As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, 'Abner, whose son is this young man?' Abner replied, 'As surely as you live, O king, I don't know.' The king said, 'Find out whose son this young man is.' As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. With David still holding, the Philistine said, 'Whose son are you, young man?' Saul asked. David said, 'I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem.'" This is in chapter 17. This is after we've read about David playing the harp for Saul and being Saul's armor bearer, being in relationship with Saul, and Saul knowing that David's father is Jesse. Here it appears that Saul doesn't know who David is, and he certainly doesn't know who his father is, which seems to tell us that these two passages are out of order, that probably David killing the Philistine, Goliath, happened before David came to serve Saul as his armor bearer, to play the harp for him. Why? So when we look at a narrative and we see that the order of the elements in the story seems to be displaced somehow, we need to ask that question. Why? Why has the writer of this narrative put these things in a different order than we would expect? Why does he tell us about David playing the harp and soothing Saul because God was with him, before he tells us about David slaying Goliath because God is with him? It's a question that we need to answer. It seems to me that the answer is this, that the writer of Samuel wanted us to know that David was a worshipper before we find out that David is a warrior. At least that is possibly a reason why these are out of order. Okay, so the order in which the story is told is important. We need to look at it and see, are there any elements that seem to be out of order? Are they, and have they been misplaced for some reason? Okay. The second thing that we look at when we're analysing a narrative is what we call narrative speed, and this is a bit of a slippery idea. It's a bit hard to analyse. There's two extremes. What we call fast narrative speed is summary, when months, years, sometimes only days, but when a whole lot of time passes and the narrative just jumps over it. For example, in Abraham's life, we don't know all of the details of every day of Abraham's life. We only know about the days when God appeared to him and the certain things that he did, and in between them we don't know anything. So when we jump over a period of time, that's very fast narrative speed. Summarize something and then leap over years is fast narrative speed. Slow narrative speed is when there's description, long description that maybe isn't even necessary to the story. And it's a very good example of this at the beginning of the book of Esther. We have this whole description of the king giving his feasts. And it takes up half the chapter, and even like in verse 6 of chapter 1, we have this whole description of the garden and all the things that were there. The garden had hangings of blue and white linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple materials, silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. We don't need to know all that, actually. It's not necessary to the story. It's very slow narrative speed. And when we have very slow narrative speed like that, we want to say, well, why is it so slow? Why have they slowed it right down? Slow narrative speed does two things. It emphasizes something, and in this case it's emphasizing the king's great power and wealth, but it also slows the narrative right down and creates suspense. So also in Esther, in chapter 2, we read all of this description of how each of the girls came to the king. Okay, before a girl's turn, starting in verse 12, before a girl's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem. Okay, we don't really need to know all that. We've been introduced to Esther at the beginning of the chapter, and we expect, because we've been introduced to her by name, that she's going to become the queen, but we're not told that she becomes the queen until we've read all of this information about the whole way it was organised, and we don't really need to know all that. The story continues quite easily. We could leave these verses out and still have the elements of the story. What it's doing is creating suspense. We've been introduced to Esther, and we're held back from knowing that she becomes the queen until the end of the chapter, and we start thinking, come on, when is it going to happen? When is she going to get to the king? When is she going to become queen? So it creates suspense. So that's slow narrative speed. It has these two effects. It emphasizes something, like in chapter 1 it emphasizes the king's greatness, or It slows the story down so that there's a creation of suspense. In between fast and slow narrative speed, we have what we would call average narrative speed, where the events and the narrative are happening at the same speed as the reading of the narrative. And that is when there is direct speech. When a person in the story is speaking, the events in the story are happening at the speed at which we are reading them. And so there's this variety of narrative speed. And the slowing and speeding up of narrative speed is what gives interest to the story and emphasizes certain things. A third thing that we look at is perspective, which is also sometimes called point of view or focus, and it helps us to think of, when we're reading the narrative, if it were a movie, where would the camera be focused? Through whose eyes are we seeing the events in the story? In Hebrew, we have a handy little word that helps us with perspective, because we can tell when perspective changes. When a story is being told, the narrator is telling us his perspective, usually. Okay? And it's generally recognized that the Hebrew, that the biblical narrator is reliable, truthful, and omniscient, knows everything, sees everything. So he tells a reliable story. When people in the story speak, they sometimes agree with what the narrator has said, and sometimes they tell us something that is quite different. Okay, let me see, Genesis. In Genesis chapter 29, in verse 1, it says, "Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the field with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well." This is the narrator telling us. "Jacob asked the shepherds, 'My brothers, where are you from?' 'We're from Haran,' they replied. He said to them, 'Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?' 'Yes, we know him,' they answered. Then Jacob asked them, 'Is he well?' 'Yes, he is,' they said. 'And here comes his daughter, Rachel, with the sheep.' 'Look,' he said." Hineh, the Hebrew word hineh, tells us that now we are seeing through Jacob's eyes. The sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be watered, to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to the pasture. 'We can't,' they replied, 'until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep.' While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep." Okay, so when Jacob speaks, and he begins with that word hineh, we're seeing Jacob's perspective. We're looking through Jacob's eyes. Okay, but it isn't always signaled by hineh, but usually a hineh tells us, hello, perspective has changed. Somebody else's viewpoint is what we are seeing now. Okay. Sometimes people's viewpoint differs wildly from what the narrator is actually saying. Again, I'm going to slip back to the book of Esther, probably because it's the one I'm most familiar with. In chapter 1, we read about how the king gave a banquet and Queen Vashti gave a banquet, and then the king invites Queen Vashti to join the men in their banquet. Actually, it was an insult. The king was drunk. It's possible Vashti was drunk as well, because her feast was a drinking feast as well. Okay, but also we know that actually in Persian culture, The only women invited to a men's feast were the concubines, and so this is an insult. She's the head wife, she's the queen, she's not a concubine, and to invite her to come was to treat her like a concubine. Some say she was invited just wearing the crown. In other words, she was invited to come naked. That would also be an insult. We can't be sure of that. However, Queen Vashti refuses. And then Memucan speaks up. Now remember, one woman has said no to one man. Then Memucan replies, in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. This is Memucan's perspective. One woman said no to one man, and now he thinks that throughout the kingdom, all the women everywhere will disobey their husbands and refuse to do what they ask them. That's his perspective. It's extreme. And it happens again in the book of Esther when one man refuses to bow down to Haman, and then Haman tells the king that all of these people disobey the king's laws. One person's perspective. So it's important when we're reading something to see whose perspective is this. Is this really the narrator, in which case it's reliable and truthful, or is it a person in the story who's seeing something from their own perspective with their own warped vision or whatever? Okay. The next element that we look at is a thing called repetition. Now, for many years, scholars use the idea of repetition to decide that there must be two sources joined together, and that's why repetition happened. But actually, it's been discovered that, and shown in narratological studies, that repetition is a very important part of what is actually the writer's intent in writing the story the way he does. The normal number of repetitions in a Hebrew narrative is 3. Often it happens like this. The writer, the narrator of the story, states something. Secondly, a person in the story restates it, sometimes with a slight difference, but sometimes in exactly the same way, and then the narrator restates it. Okay, now usually if it's repeated like that 3 times and they're identical, then it's very important. And the reason why the writer is repeating it is because it's something that's extremely important that needs to be emphasized. Sometimes it shows us that the person who speaks has a perspective that's slightly different from the narrator, that they picked up something that is not quite right. Okay, we can see this in Genesis chapter 3. Well, starting in chapter 2, when God makes his covenant with Adam, he says in chapter 2 verse 16, and the Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. Okay, you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. That's a statement God makes. In chapter 3, the serpent says, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Well, there's an exaggeration. It was one tree. Okay. The woman says we may eat from the fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die. God did not say you must not touch it. At least we don't have a record of him saying that. Eve has added, although there's a repetition here, it's Eve speaking, and she has added, just like the serpent adds some doubt, any tree in the garden. Okay, so these perspectives are different. And the repetition reveals the differences between them. Again, in the book of Esther, in chapter 6, we have a very interesting thing happening. Okay. The king says to Haman in verse 6, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honour?" Okay, that's the first statement. Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honour than me?" That's the second time it's stated. Actually, the English translation changes it a bit, but the words are almost identical, apart from the idea that Haman's thinking about it himself. So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honour," that's the third time, "have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden on, with a royal crest on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honour," that's the fourth one, "and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honour.'" 5. "Go at once," the king commanded Haman, "get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman got the robe and the horse, and led him on the horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the king, the man the king delights to honour." 6 times. This phrase is used 6 times. The first time the king has said it, the other 5 times Haman says it. And it's only the last time that he says it about Mordecai. He thinks it's about him. And it creates this really funny picture, because we know it's not about him, actually, right from the very beginning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is an extreme of repetition here, and it shows us that Haman is really, really excited about the idea of being the man whom the king delights to honour, and he thinks he is the person. It's only the last repetition where he's actually describing Mordecai, and that makes it really very funny. So repetitions emphasize things. They show us where people have a slightly different perspective from what is really the truth that the narrator has stated, and so they have important impact in a particular story. The next thing we notice is direct speech. Okay, it's important to analyze the direct speech. Who speaks most, usually tell us who are the most important people in the story. And so it's important to see, well, okay, who is speaking? Who has the biggest speaking parts? Biggest speaking parts for important people. In the book of Esther, the king speaks the most, but Esther speaks the second most. Now, a lot of people, when they interpret the book of Esther, make Mordecai out to be the most important person there, apart from the king. But actually, the amount of speech tells us that Esther is the second most important person here, and Mordecai doesn't actually say a whole lot. So the direct speech is important to analyse how much of the text is taken up with a person speaking, and if the person, is it all one person who's most important in that particular portion of the story. At the beginning of the book of Esther, Memucan gives a great big long speech, longer than the king's speech. Now, throughout the whole book, Memucan doesn't say a whole lot more, but in chapter 1 he becomes the most important person, because he has a lot to say. Another thing that we need to notice about direct speech is, what does the speech actually contain? Are there questions? Are there answers? People who ask questions are not so well informed. People who answer questions are better informed. In the book of Esther, we find that there are 17 speeches recorded that the king made. 15 of them are questions. And what that gives the overall impression is that the king doesn't really know what's going on. The 2 times he speaks when he doesn't ask a question are 2 classic blunders that he makes. One is when Haman tells him about this people that he should get rid of, and he doesn't ask who they are. So he doesn't find out that one of them is his wife. And the second time is when Harbona tells him that there's a gallows standing outside that Haman was going to hang Mordecai on, and he says, hang Haman on it. And the reason he says that is because he thinks Haman was trying to rape his wife. It's not because Haman was trying to destroy all the Jews. He thinks Haman is trying to rape his wife, and so he has them hanged. Actually, Haman wasn't trying to rape his wife, he was begging for mercy. So it's not that he brings about justice with that hanging. He makes a statement, one of the only two statements that he makes, without knowing the full facts and having made a mistake by what he observes. So speeches and who states them, who asks questions, who answers them, all give us a picture of who are the people who are significant in the story, and it also gives an impression of which people know what's going on and which ones don't, who's most intelligent and who's a bit stupid, and so on. So quite important. Verb forms are also quite important. The normal verb forms in Hebrew narrative are cows. Okay, they're just simple action verbs or stative verbs. Okay, and we have actually in Walker O'Connor, there's a verb chart that shows what percentage of verbs are cow, what percentage in normal Hebrew narrative, what percentage in nifal, what percentage are passive participles, what percentage are PL, and so on. Okay, we have a very interesting thing in the book of Esther. If you add up all the passive forms, nifals, passive participles, hofals, puals, you find that the total normal percentage for those verbs, passive verbs, is 7% in any normal Hebrew narrative. 7%. But in the book of Esther, there are 15% of the verbs are passives. If you add all the nifals, the hofals, the puals, and the passive participles together, you get 15% of the verbs in the book are passives. That's a glaring difference between what is normal. It's more than double. So one has to say, why is this happening? Well, passive verbs describe somebody acting on the subject of the verb. Okay, the somebody we don't know, not referred to. Somebody from outside of the story or outside of the text acting on the subjects in the text. In Greek, there's a recognized passive called a divine passive. The passive is used to describe things that God is doing. Nobody's ever described it in Hebrew, but I suspect that's what is happening here. We have a divine passive. God is not mentioned in the text, but the passive verbs suggest somebody outside the text acting on the people in the text, and that's actually quite important. But there's another way in which passive verbs work. They remove responsibility. In Esther chapter 2, the beginning of the chapter, it says, later when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done. And in the Hebrew it says, and what had been decreed about her. Now my English translation here has changed it and says what he had decreed about her. But that's not how the Hebrew states it. The Hebrew uses a passive verb. He remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed about her. It seems to suggest that the king was not the one who decreed it. It removes him from the immediate responsibility. And that happens in a variety of places. Okay, so passive verbs do two things. They suggest an actor outside of the text, acting on people or objects in the text, but they also remove responsibility for actions from certain people. So looking at the verb forms can help us to correctly analyse what is really happening in the text and form part of the picture of what is the narrator's or the author's intent. And then finally we have irony. Dramatic irony is defined as what happens when the reader knows some things that the actors in the text do not know. And again, we see this very clearly at the beginning of chapter 6 of Esther. The king does not know why Haman has come to see him, and Haman does not know who is the person the king wants to honor. But the reader knows both things. The reader knows King wants to honor Mordecai, and the reader knows Haman wants to hang Mordecai. And that's what makes this chapter really quite amusing. The irony of it all as you read it, that you know that the king wants to honor Mordecai, Haman wants to hang Mordecai, and they're talking at cross purposes to each other because they don't know that piece of information. Haman does not know the king wants to honor Mordecai. The king does not know Haman wants to hang Mordecai. And it produces a dramatic irony of something that makes us smile, that appears to be quite funny. And so we have to be aware when a narrator is speaking ironically, when he's showing us something that is amusing because of the ignorance of the people in the plot. So when we put all of these elements together, they help us get a picture of the intent of the writer. Okay? Because a writer puts a story together for a particular purpose. They don't just tell what happened 100% objectively. They can't, because people aren't 100% objective anyway. When somebody writes a story, they write it for the purpose, a specific purpose, and they construct the story to help with that purpose. And when we put all of these elements together and analyze them, connect them together, we can start to see the purpose of the author and what the narrative is really telling us. Sometimes if we just read it at face value, we don't really get the depth of what is coming through the narrative. And so in your exegesis, whatever book it is that you're doing your exegesis on, if it's a narrative book, then you need to use these elements to analyze the narrative and to bring out a greater depth of what is actually happening in a particular narrative. I'm just going to pop back to direct speech because there's a passage that I should have looked at that I forgot to tell you about. In 1 Samuel, chapter 31, starting in verse 3, it says, "The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, 'Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me.' But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him." Okay, so the narrator is telling us this. Saul took his own sword and fell on it. Saul committed suicide. Okay. 2 Samuel chapter 1. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and with dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked him. "Tell me." He said, "The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord." It's a different story. This Amalekite says he killed Saul. The narrator tells us at the end of 1 Samuel that Saul killed himself. Who's telling the truth? Well, the general understanding of the biblical narrator is that he's reliable. He's telling the truth. The Amalekite's telling a lie. Why does he tell a lie? Probably because he thinks that David will reward him for defeating his enemy, for killing his enemy. But he misunderstands David. He makes a big mistake and he pays for it with his life. David has him killed. So this is an analysis of direct speech which helps us to understand that the Amalekite is lying. It's not a contradiction. It's just a straight out lie. The narrator faithfully records man's lie. Also, it's interesting that he's an Amalekite. You know, Saul's mistake right at the beginning of his rule was that he was supposed to destroy all the Amalekites. He didn't. And here we have an Amalekite who claims to have killed him. We have another Amalekite later on who causes a great deal of difficulty. His name is Haman. He comes up in the book of Esther. He's a descendant of King Agag, the Amalekite king, whom Saul did not destroy. Knowing your biblical narratives is a very important thing to help you to understand how the narrative works and what elements in it are significant. Okay, so when you're doing exegesis and you're analysing a narrative, I know I've used a lot of examples from the book of Esther today, but I've used examples from elsewhere as well. And whatever book that you're doing or passage that you're doing your exegesis on, if it's a narrative, then you need to be aware of these things that will help you thoroughly analyse a narrative and see what elements are there that you might have missed if you were just reading through its skimming. Okay.